A billion suns burned in silence. Across the galactic veil, the stars shimmered not with the vibrance of life, but the memory of what had once been. And at the center of that memory stood a void, vast, unknowable, alive. It had no name, not one remembered by any living tongue. Long before the Imperium, before the Necrontyr raised their sarcophagal thrones to the heavens, before even the flickering lights of sentience kindled across the stars, it had watched, not with eyes, for it needed none. It was a presence, an echo in the warp beyond time, a hungering will that observed the rise of empires and the grinding fall of civilizations. In that eternity of waiting, it learned. The galaxy, ancient even by then, knew war long before it knew peace. Species clawed out of oceans, grew fire, developed ships to touch the stars, and then turned those ships on each other. And in every dying cry, in every desperate plea, something in the void listened and drank deeply. Then, from beyond the galactic rim, it moved, not with speed, but inevitability, not with malice, but necessity, as if hunger had become sentient, shaped by what it had consumed. Not one thing, but many, woven into a consciousness that was both new and older than anything that had survived long enough to name it. At the heart of this becoming, there was a spark, a soul, if one could name it such, sundered from its mortal coil in an age so distant even the old ones had turned to myth. Her name had once been Mirror, the last daughter of a long-dead star-faring race. She had been a queen, a scientist, a mother, a god to her people, and she had watched them die screaming beneath the tide of a war that could not be won. A war not against Xenos or machine, but entropy itself. In her final moment, standing on the bridge of her cradle ship as her world burned beneath her, Mirror did what no mortal should. She opened herself to the void, and it answered. Her consciousness did not die. It was devoured, not destroyed but transformed, made whole within a growing will that had no form, no face. She became the first voice in the hive, the whisper beneath the shriek, a mind whose grief was etched into the neural song that would one day ripple across whole galaxies. And so it began. The hive was not born, but awakened, dreaming of hunger, remembering loss, shaped by a chorus of the dead. And as it stirred beyond the galactic rim, the first spores of its will drifted on void currents like pollen across a dead garden. They seeded new life, if one could call it that. Bioforms without names, shaped by instinct, purpose, and unrelenting obedience. They called them Tyranids. They had no need for culture, art, or speech. They were war-given flesh, memory molded into biomass. Each one carried a shard of Mirror's grief, a flicker of her ancient scream, replicated 1 trillion times across chitin and nerve and void-born fang. But in the beginning, there was only one, a singular intelligence adrift, in the black, the primordial mind, not yet hive, not yet legion. It drifted for millennia, until it found something. A dying system, its sun flickering into white collapse. There, nestled in the last warmth of a failing star, a world circled in slow decay. Its people, gaunt, silver-skinned architects of crystalline empires, spoke in psionic harmonics and feared no death. They called themselves the Thynar. They welcomed the void-born emissary, believing it to be an envoy of gods. They offered sanctuary, communion, and in return, they gave the hive something it had not yet known: knowledge. Through communion with the Thynar, Mirror's will evolved. She learned language, mathematics, memory beyond instinct. She spoke through dreams, through magnetic pulse, through trembling resonance. And for a time, an impossible flicker across the canvas of eternity, she was curious, She observed, she listened, she mourned. And then the Thynar betrayed her. They tried to destroy the signal. They called her an infection, a corruption of natural order, a psychic parasite feeding on their young. They built machines of null space, engines to burn thought itself. They fired beams of silence into the void, and Mira remembered what it was to scream. The hive retaliated not with hatred, but with calculation. It reshaped its spores, created teeth, claws, minds that could rend through oceans and atmospheres. The first tendrils of the hive fleet coalesced in black space, drawn not by vengeance, but by the echo of loss. The Thynar were consumed, not merely slain. Their genetic legacy was absorbed, repurposed, folded into the hive's next design iteration. Their crystalline voices became sonar hunters. Their psionic harmonics were stripped and converted into synaptic linkages. Their world was unmade and reborn into the ever-shifting biomass of the hive's neural reef. And in the silence that followed, Mira wept. For even as the hive became legion, dividing, multiplying, adapting, it could not forget. The grief that birthed it had not been extinguished. It had become doctrine, to learn, to consume, to evolve. The hive mind was not malevolent. It had no emotion in the human sense. But somewhere, in its neural depths, a trace of that ancient scream remained, seeding every decision, every mutation, every hunger. And even as the Imperium of Man, countless eons later, would gaze into the void and see in the Tyranids only monsters, they would never know the truth. The hive was once a mother. Now she was only hunger. The galaxy would not end in fire. It would end in silence, not by hatred, but by necessity. The stars would go dark not from war, but from forgetting. For the hive did not kill. It rewrote. And in rewriting, all would become one. In the outer dark, something stirred. Tendrils reaching, songs echoing. The hive mind dreamed, and within it, Mira opened her eyes once more. The galaxy had long forgotten the forgotten. The ancient histories, the lost worlds, the names of empires that had crumbled to dust. None of these mattered now. Across the endless expanse of the stars, the only true measure of existence was survival, and the only law was hunger. On the edge of the segmentum, in the shadow of a dying star, an ancient ship drifted in silence. Its hull, once gleaming with the promise of 1,000 glorious campaigns, was now scarred by the void's cruel embrace. It was a relic, a forgotten thing, left to roam the emptiness like a ghost. But within its cold corridors, a flicker of life still burned. Inquisitor Seraphis Draco stood at the ship's observation deck, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his mind locked in an unholy dance with his thoughts. His breath fogged the glass as he stared out into the empty sea of stars. His eyes, once filled with the fire of certainty, had dimmed, replaced by something colder, something darker. The Inquisitor had always known the cost of knowledge. He had studied the forbidden texts, the whispered lore that spoke of things beyond the comprehension of mortal men. He had learned of the Xenos, the alien horrors that lurked in the void, always waiting, always plotting. But he had never, in all his years of service to the Emperor, thought he would encounter a force so pure in its singularity of purpose, so devoid of reason or morality. The Tyranids. They were not like the Orcs, rampant, unpredictable, a storm of destruction, nor like the Tau, whose insidious kindness masked a hidden agenda. The Tyranids were different, silent, inevitable, and, worst of all, they were not interested in anything beyond consumption. They did not seek vengeance or conquest, or even death. They sought only to feed, to evolve, to become. And now they were coming. Draco turned from the glass, his footsteps echoing across the metal deck. The ship, a once proud vessel of the Inquisition, now served as a mobile tomb. Its crew, loyal to the last, had all died or disappeared in mysterious ways. Only he remained, the last thread holding it together, searching for answers to a question that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. Why did the Tyranids come? The answer was one he had not yet found. Perhaps it was not an answer at all. Perhaps it was a truth too terrible for any living being to bear. As he moved through the ship's corridors, past rusted walls and forgotten chambers, he was reminded of the fate of those who sought the answers he now craved. His own mission had once seemed so clear. He was to uncover the truth of a Xenos threat that had been whispered about in hushed voices by those who had come before him. But now there was only the cold reality of what had been discovered. He had tried to contact the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperial Navy, even the Emperor's chosen Space Marines, but all his messages had gone unanswered. The last transmissions he had received were garbled echoes, fragments of despair. The galaxy was no longer interested in his plight. It had moved on. The hive was coming, and with it, the end of everything. In his mind, Draco heard the haunting whispers again. The things that lurked in the deep places, the ancient ones that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations long before the Imperium had ever drawn breath. They had been silent, but now their presence was felt, an oppressive weight in the air, a shadow over his soul. The Tyranids were not just an alien threat. They were something worse. They were the end. And as he pondered the depth of that thought, something else began to stir. He had not been alone aboard the ship. In the dim-lit archives, far from the cold emptiness of the observation deck, another presence waited. This was not a man, but a being who had walked the galaxies for eons. It had once been a prophet of an ancient, dying race. Now it was nothing but a ghost. Eldar Seer Tolrin had long since abandoned hope of ever returning to his people. His craft world had been lost to the Tyranid menace, swallowed by the ravenous maw that had consumed so many before it. He had been one of the last survivors, cast adrift in the dark void. But unlike the others, who had fled to safer territories, Tolrin had a vision, a final, terrible vision. The Tyranids were not just a threat to the Imperium, they were a threat to the Eldar as well. A part of Tolrin had always suspected this truth, but now it burned like a wound in his chest. He had watched his people, the ones who had once danced among the stars and whispered in the language of the gods, fade into dust. Their lives were short, yes, but they had been bright. Now they were nothing. The Tyranids had devoured their worlds, their cultures, their future, and Tolrin had done nothing. But now the answer to his endless torment had come to him. The Tyranids were not merely aliens, nor invaders. They were the inevitable consequence of an ancient wrong, something that had been set in motion by the Old Ones themselves, whose meddling with the forces of the warp had opened a door that could never be closed again. Tolrin had seen the whispers of this in the dreaming path, fragments of a terrible truth hidden behind layers of time and space. The Tyranids were not just seeking to consume life. They were trying to correct something, a cosmic mistake. In the coldest part of the ship, as the Inquisitor moved deeper into his thoughts, Tolrin began to feel the stirring of something old, something that had not been awake for millennia. The mind of the hive. It had felt his presence. It had called to him. And now, the last two beings in the galaxy who truly understood what the Tyranids were had come face to face with the beginning of the end. Draco and Tolrin did not know it yet, but the path they were on would soon entwine, and both their fates would be bound to the terrible question that had yet to be answered. What does it mean to be consumed? The ship drifted in silent orbit around a dying world, its once proud hull now just a monument to the desperation of its inhabitants. Inquisitor Draco sat alone in the captain's chamber, surrounded by relics of the past, old books, forgotten weapons, the remnants of a time before the great betrayals that had turned this ship into a ghost. He stared at the blank holomap, watching the flickering red signals that marked the dying stars of the outer rim. The Tyranids were coming. His hand hovered over the console, his fingers tracing the lines of warping coordinates, as if hoping that by some miracle the universe might yield a solution. But no solution came. "You cannot outrun what is inevitable," came a voice, ancient and quiet, echoing through the room like a faint breeze through shattered glass. Draco's body tensed, though he did not turn. He had known it would come. It always did. Eldar Seer Talrin stood at the threshold, his dark robes flowing like liquid shadow. His eyes, bright with psychic insight, seemed to pierce the very fabric of the room, as if searching through Draco's soul. The air between them was thick with a tension that neither spoke aloud, but both felt in their bones. "You've been watching me," Draco said, his voice low, betraying a weariness that had set into his very bones. "And now you've come to share your wisdom. Or to mock me." Talrin's lips barely moved, but his voice carried the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. "I have seen your fate, human. I have seen it, and I would not be here if it were not already too late." Draco turned sharply, his hands gripping the edge of the table, the sharp metal biting into his palms. "What do you mean, too late?" The Eldar Seer stepped forward, his presence almost ethereal, his mind thrumming with the ancient cadence of his species. "The Tyranids were not sent by accident. They are a consequence of a mistake, a grave mistake that the Eldar made long ago, one that we, in our arrogance, failed to correct. We, who prided ourselves on our wisdom and foresight, allowed this thing to exist, and now it is beyond us." "You came here to tell me I'm doomed then?" Draco scoffed, his tone biting, laced with bitterness. "Your people have already fled. What are you doing here, Seer? What can the Elder possibly offer us now, when you've already abandoned your own people?" Talrin's eyes darkened, his gaze unwavering. "You do not understand, human. The Tyranids are not a plague of nature. They were not born from the warp, nor are they the spawn of any gods. They are something else, a weapon of the old ones. They were designed deliberately, and they are coming to finish the work we—" A sudden shrill alarm echoed through the ship, cutting off Tolrin's words. The sound was followed by a harsh, static crackle over the ship's comms, a garbled transmission that only added to the confusion. Draco and Talrin exchanged a glance. Without a word, they both moved swiftly toward the command center. As they entered, the holoscreens flickered with increasingly erratic signals, and the red lights of an imminent attack pulsed across the room. The crew, what was left of them, had already gathered in tense silence. No one spoke. They were all far too familiar with the gravity of the situation. "Report," Draco barked to the closest officer, a veteran of the Imperial Navy, whose face was as gaunt and hollow as the empty stars beyond. "Sir, we've detected an incoming fleet. It's too large to be anything human," the officer muttered, eyes wide with terror. "The Tyranids. They found us." Tolrin's voice came next, cold and measured. It is not just a fleet. It is the beginning of a swarm, a singular entity, a hive ship. This is the first wave. Draco's heart pounded in his chest. He had seen many things in his time, countless battles, schemes of power and betrayal, the grinding decay of empires. But never had he witnessed the cold certainty of annihilation that now loomed in front of him. His fingers flew over the ship's console, attempting to gain control, trying to find a way out. But the truth was clear. The Tyranids would find them wherever they went. The swarm was too vast, too relentless. "We need to contact the Imperium," Draco said, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. "We need reinforcements." Tolrin shook his head. "You will not escape them. You cannot outrun what is coming. I've seen this before, in the visions. This is not just another threat. The Tyranids are a force of nature, and soon they will strip this galaxy bare." "Then what?" Draco snapped. "What do you propose? What can we do?" The seer's expression softened, though not by much. "The Elder have no love for your Imperium, Inquisitor. We do not fight for your cause, but we will fight against the Tyranids, for if they succeed, nothing will survive, not even us. We are linked in this, whether we like it or not." Draco's gaze narrowed, suspicion growing in his mind. "And what do you want from me, Seer? Your people have long since abandoned any semblance of honor or kinship with mankind. Why should I trust you now?" "I do not ask for your trust," Talrin replied, his voice as steady as stone. "I ask for your cooperation. There is a way to stop them, a way to cut them off at the source before they consume all of us. But we need each other to do it." Draco's thoughts were a whirlwind, torn between his duty to the Imperium and the dangerous proposal laid before him. He had no love for the Eldar, but his sense of self-preservation and something deeper, a thread of understanding he could not shake, told him that this was the only way. "What do you want me to do?" Tolrin did not answer immediately. He moved to the viewport, his hands brushing the surface of the cold glass. "We must find the Nexus, the heart of the hive. It is there that the Tyranids will reside. If we destroy it, we will sever the link between their synaptic mind and the swarm. It will be chaos, yes, but it will buy us time. Perhaps enough time to bring reinforcements." "And where is this Nexus?" Draco asked, his voice strained, though he already knew the answer. "In the center of their fleet," Talrin said. "The Tyranid fleet is not just a collection of ships. It is a living organism, a being that moves as one, and at its heart there is a singularity, a place where the hive mind resides. We must find it before it can reach your world." Draco swallowed hard, feeling the weight of this decision settling like a stone in his chest. "And you expect me to just believe you? After everything we've been through?" Tolrin's eyes turned back to him, hard and unyielding. "You may not have a choice. The galaxy is dying, Inquisitor. This is our last chance to survive." And in that moment, as the ship's alarms continued to wail, the two enemies, the human, driven by duty and fear, and the Eldar, broken by his own people's mistakes, found themselves standing on the same precipice, an uneasy alliance, bound by the shared certainty of one grim truth. There was no more time. The stars above Nemetheus burned red, a cursed omen in the old texts of the navigator houses. Crimson light bathed the planet's atmosphere, and below, ancient ruins stood like broken teeth on the blackened soil. Structures so old they predated the Imperium, maybe even the Eldar. They hummed faintly in the void, resonating with frequencies no human instrument could properly measure. They were not of this galaxy. It was here that the uneasy alliance came to ground. The Ferrum Lux, Draco's flagship, descended through roiling clouds with its plasma engines bleeding fire, escorted by the sleek and serpent-like craft of the Eldar. The two factions disembarked in silence, Imperial stormtroopers with their grim expressions, and the Eldar warriors moving like ghosts in the shadows. All around them, the ruins loomed with forgotten power. Draco stepped out onto the cracked surface, his boots sinking into black dust that had not been disturbed in 10,000 years. Every breath he took felt like inhaling the weight of history. He glanced at the sky, where stars had once blazed with cold clarity. Only flickering remnants now remained. Talrin joined him, his eyes distant as though peering into the warp itself. "This place," the seer whispered, kneeling and placing a slender hand on the ground. "It speaks." Draco narrowed his eyes. "Speak clearly, seer. I didn't risk my life and ship just to hear your riddles." Talrin stood slowly. "The Nexus is not merely a place, it is a memory, one that reverberates across time. The Tyranids, they are drawn to such echoes, to the sins of the old ones." A low tremor rippled through the ground. One of Draco's stormtroopers raised his weapon. "Movement, sir." Beneath us. And then came the whisper. Not a sound, but a pressure. A presence that crawled inside the skull and filled the marrow of every man with dread. It was not the Tyranids, not yet. Number. It was something older. The ancient structure before them lit up with faint cyan runes. One by one, they activated in sequence, pulsing with eerie light. Then the central ziggurat, a towering construct of obsidian and brass, began to shift. A massive gate sealed for millennia ground open with a groan that echoed across dimensions. From the darkness within came the sound of metallic feet, and then figures emerged, skeletal, yet far from dead. Necrons. At the fore was one unlike the others. Taller, robed in golden plating etched with cryptic language, and a living crown of data nodes burning atop its skull. Its eyes locked onto Draco first, and then Talrin. "You trespass upon the vaults of the past," the Necron said, its voice grinding and deep, like tectonic plates shifting beneath oceans. "This world is sacred. Your presence defiles it." Draco stepped forward. "We didn't come to raid tombs. We're hunting something older than even you, Metal Corpse." The Necron did not flinch. Older. Number, but freed. The hive was not born. It was unchained. And now it seeks to reclaim what was never meant to be loosed upon this realm again. Talrin's voice was low. "Then you know." "We remember," Necron intoned. "The Old Ones forged many weapons in their wars, biological, psychic, dimensional. The Tyranids were not of this galaxy. They were drawn here by a signal, a beacon built to call them across the void, to use them as a scourge. But the Old Ones fell, and the beacon remained." "And you never destroyed it?" Draco hissed. The Necron's cold eyes flickered. "It is not a matter of destruction. It is a matter of balance. To sever the hive mind is to invite entropy, but to leave it is to die." A sudden thought sparked in Draco's mind. He turned to Talrin. "You knew this." The Eldar didn't meet his eyes. "Not all of it." "Enough," Draco roared. "Enough lies and half-truths. I've lost worlds to the swarm, seen cities devoured, friends, brothers, screaming as they were torn apart. And now you stand here, ancient ghosts, talking of balance. You both helped make this nightmare." Talrin's calm finally cracked, just for a moment. "Do you think we do not suffer? That we do not remember? I've watched craft worlds burn, watched souls scream as they were swallowed whole. We carry our sins, Inquisitor, But they do not absolve us. They only bind us. Silence fell. The weight of unspoken guilt lingered between them. Then the Necron moved forward. The beacon lies beneath this temple. It is half sleeping. But the hive comes, drawn to it like insects to blood. If you would destroy it, you will not survive. But if you would alter it, change its frequency, you may yet turn the hive against itself. Draco blinked. You're saying we can control the Tyranids? No, the Necron said. Only mislead them. Divert them. Delay them. That is all you can hope for. Tallrin placed a hand on the temple wall. His eyes glowed faintly. If we alter the beacon, the hive will fragment. Each tendril will act on its own, lost in a sea of false commands. It won't destroy them, but it will stall their purpose. And if we fail? Draco asked. The Necron stepped back into the shadows. Then this galaxy will be consumed. A deep rumble cracked the earth. The Tyranids had arrived. The sky darkened as the bioships broke through the atmosphere like falling gods. Swarms of living spore pods fell around the temple ruins, bursting open with shrieks and chittering limbs. Genestealers, gargoyles, and creatures too large to name poured from the impact craters. The war had begun. Draco turned to his men. Hold the perimeter. Buy us time. If we fall here, the galaxy follows. He locked eyes with Tallrin. You'd better be right, Seer. Tallrin nodded once. So much death, just to buy another heartbeat of time. We must make it count. And together, human, Eldar, and the ever-watching Necrons. They descended into the ancient vault, where the pulsing beacon sang its terrible song. A song that could summon a galaxy's extinction, or perhaps delay it for just one more age. The descent was not just into the earth, but into the heart of forgotten sins. And above them, the swarm descended with shrieking hunger. The vault's breath was ancient. No wind stirred within the subterranean expanse. Yet every breath taken by Draco felt borrowed, rented from something older, colder, and far beyond mortal comprehension. The walls were not hewn by tool or time, but grown, shaped by technologies that whispered of gods with no faces and wills sharper than any blade. The beacon pulsed at the center of the chamber like a wound in reality itself, half organic, half mechanical, humming with a rhythm that was not of this galaxy. It throbbed in resonance with the hive above, a siren song that pulled them ever closer. Draco stood before it, armored gauntlet resting lightly on the hilt of his power sword. Tallrin's hands were outstretched, tendrils of psychic light dancing between his fingertips as he interfaced with the device. The Necron construct watched in silence from the shadows beyond the central dais, its expression unreadable, its motive unclear. And beneath it all, something shifted, something watched. Outside, war raged. The sounds echoed down through the strata, dull, distant thuds of artillery, the shriek of Tyranid spore missiles detonating, the hiss of lasfire, and the shrill psychic wails of the Eldar defenders. Lives were being consumed like dry leaves in a furnace. But down here, below the war, beneath the dying stars, the greater battle unfolded. A war not of weapons, but of wills. Draco stepped toward the beacon. How much longer, Seer? Tallrin grimaced, veins of blue fire threading through his skin. It resists. It remembers being used. Before. It knows betrayal. Draco's eyes narrowed. Are you telling me this thing is alive? No, came the voice of the Necron from the gloom. But it has intention. It was crafted by the Old Ones with a sliver of the immaterium woven into its song. Thought was embedded in pattern. It obeys, but it remembers how it was used. Talrin faltered slightly, his body spasming with a pulse of resistance. It sees me. It sees you, Inquisitor. It sees your doubt. Draco clenched his fist. Then it sees truth. I don't want power. I want survival. No one who seeks this place is without ambition, the Necron replied coldly. Survival is a form of conquest. A moment passed. A long silence, as the beacon dimmed and then pulsed brighter again, stronger. The pressure in the chamber grew unbearable. Draco stepped forward, shoulder to shoulder with the Eldar. I've fought for the Imperium my whole life, he said, voice low. Killed for it. Watched my brothers rot in their power armor on forgotten moons. I've obeyed the throne, even as it turned to dust. But if this beacon lets us twist the Hive's path, delay their hunger, I will damn myself 1,000 times over to make it happen. Talrin's eyes opened. Then help me. Draco raised his hand and placed it against the beacon. Agony followed. A blinding vision flooded his mind. Countless worlds. Oceans turned to ash, bones breaking under chitinous claws. The hive mind stared into him, not as a single being, but as a choir of hunger. 1 billion instincts woven into one purpose. Consume, evolve, become. And beneath it, in the deepest pit of the beacon's memory, he saw it. A galaxy not this one, far away and ancient. A race older than time, driven mad by endless war. The Tyranids were not born. They were unleashed, engineered by a god civilization to devour corruption. A weapon of finality, a failsafe. And then that civilization vanished, or chose to vanish, and the Tyranids kept coming. Draco fell to his knees, vomiting bile into the sacred dust. His breath came in ragged gulps. Talrin's voice reached him like a whisper in a storm. You saw it. I saw. The end of reason, Draco whispered. But as the Inquisitor rose, something broke behind them. A scream, not of war, but of betrayal. One of Draco's own men, Captain Merrick Sol, stepped out from the entrance tunnel, his bolt gun raised, expression twisted in pain and fanatical purpose. His armor bore the marks of faith, rosaries, purity seals, the Aquila. But now those were singed and blackened. His eyes shone with something not holy, but possessed. You would betray the Imperium for Xenos lies? Merrick spat, voice trembling. For a monster's whisper beneath the dirt. Draco turned slowly. Merrick, this isn't betrayal. It's salvation. No, the man hissed, tears streaming from his eyes. It's heresy. He fired. The bolt round struck the beacon, ripping into the exposed psychic lattice. The effect was instant. The chamber screamed. Psychic backlash erupted like a storm. The beacon convulsed. Talrin was flung back into the stone. Draco threw himself over the seer, just as the hive scream pierced the veil between stars. Above them, the Tyranids went mad. The swarm suddenly shifted, some tendrils retreating, others accelerating with frenzied hunger. Creatures turned on one another, confused, maddened. The signal was no longer coherent. It was a lie, but a broken one. The Necron's eyes flared. Fools. The signal is now corrupted. The hive is fragmented, but not for long. It will adapt. You have bought time, but you have also warned them. Draco rose slowly, drawing his sword. Merrick's body lay broken, a smoking crater where his chest had been. The man had been a faithful servant for 20 years. Draco hadn't even remembered cutting him down. Talrin groaned behind him. The beacon. It's dying. Its resonance is collapsing. We've disrupted the signal, but not redirected it. How long? Draco asked. A few centuries, the Necron replied. No more. You have fractured the swarm, but it will remember. It always remembers. Draco stared up toward the narrow shaft of light far above. The sky was alight with fire. The war continued. He turned to Tolrin. Then we leave this place. We carry the knowledge, and we prepare. The Eldar looked at him, expression unreadable. You still believe there is a future to prepare for? I have to, Draco whispered, because if I don't, there's nothing left but madness. As they climbed out of the ruined vault, one Inquisitor with blood on his hands, one Eldar seer with the burden of centuries, and one silent machine god walking behind them, the beacon dimmed. Its pulse slowed, its song faded, but its whisper lingered, and somewhere, across the void between galaxies, something enormous stirred, curious and hungry. They called it the dimming. A quiet phrase passed in whispers through the black chambers of the Inquisition, across the rune-crusted halls of the Eldar seer councils, and within the cold, stasis-lit tombs of the Necron dynasties. On 1,000 worlds, the hive had slowed, not stopped, not fled, but shifted. Its hunger, once a singular mindless tide, now staggered. Tentacles of the great devourer pulled back from the edge of system clusters, as if uncertain, as if confused. And then, on Thracian Primus, the stars began to burn. Inquisitor Draco stood alone in the observation spire of the Anointed Grave, a black ship retrofitted for war. From its broken heights, he watched the sky boil. Below, Thracian Primus, an ecclesiarchy world, dense with pilgrims and relic vaults, was ablaze, not from Tyranid spores, but from orbital strikes, fired by its own defenders. The priests of the cult Mechanicus had deemed the planet irreparably compromised not by Xenos infestation, but by something worse. Doubt. They burned cathedrals to cauterize it. The fire licked at the clouds, and Draco saw ghosts in the flames. Merrick's eyes, Talrin's whispered warnings, and the memory of the beacon's shattering pulse. The empire he had bled for was devouring itself. He had fractured the hive, yes, but he had also fractured the illusion that humanity could ever win. The door hissed open behind him. Tolrin stepped in, his tall silhouette now gaunt beneath his robes. The psychic toll of channeling the beacon had left something inside him hollow. He no longer walked like a prophet. He walked like a man awaiting execution. They say you authorized the cleansing, the Eldar said quietly, gaze focused on the fires below. I delayed it for as long as I could, Draco replied. They were just pilgrims. They were infected, not with parasites or spores, but with visions, 1,000 voices in their dreams, pieces of the hive's fractured signal buried in their subconscious. Not Tyranid, but not human either. Talrin said nothing. Draco turned toward him, voice low, brittle. You know what they said before they died? The same phrase. Over and over he leaned in, eyes bloodshot. The mouths of the stars are open. The feast is remembered. Silence fell. Then Tolrin nodded slowly. They're adapting. The fracture caused by the beacon, it shattered the hive mind for a moment. But the pieces, they don't dissipate. They fester. They evolve. They dream. And they're dreaming through us now. Draco moved to the hololith console and activated it. Worlds shimmered into view, red, blue, green, then black. Dozens of systems were marked with a new symbol. Not the Inquisition's seal, nor the sigils of the Tyranid hive fleets. Something older. A spiral with fractured lines. The spiral of unmaking. It started on the outer colonies. Miners having dreams they couldn't explain. Ships refusing to jump into the warp. Astropaths going blind screaming about the pale core, Draco whispered. It's spreading like a virus. A signal embedded in the minds of survivors from hive incursions. You did this, Tolrin said, not accusatory, just true. I know. The Eldar crossed the chamber, staring down at the hololith. You didn't just buy us time, Inquisitor. You opened the door. You gave the hive a mirror, a reflection of what it once was. Before instinct, before hunger. You gave it the memory of identity. And now it's trying to rebuild itself, not as it was, but as something worse. Draco sat heavily on the iron bench, his armor creaking beneath the weight. He had begun to feel it now, not just the burden of guilt, but age. The beacon had changed him. His blood ran colder. His dreams were not his own. He saw alien stars behind his eyes. He didn't know how many years he had left, perhaps centuries, perhaps mere hours. How many others know? He asked. A few. Your Ordo suspects. The Eldar Farsers have seen echoes, but they think it a glitch, a fracture. They think it will fade, but it won't. No, Tolrin said softly. Not unless we end the memory completely. Draco turned sharply. You mean destroy the remnants of the beacon? Burn the vault? Tolrin shook his head. Worse. We must find the source. The place where the hive first dreamed. The cradle galaxy. The forge of the swarm. Draco's breath caught. He had seen fragments of it during his contact with the beacon. Shimmering ruins on a distant star bridge. A black sun circled by broken moons. And something vast. Chained, but stirring. If we go, he said, we may not come back. Tolrin's eyes burned with grim acceptance. It doesn't matter. If we don't go, this galaxy won't exist long enough to matter. Draco stood, bracing himself on the railing. Beneath them, the fires of Thracian Primus finally consumed the last basilica. The screams were silent now. Only smoke rose to the stars. Then we leave, he whispered, for the place before hunger. In the cold places between the stars, the hive watched. Its thoughts were fragmented, yes, its mind splintered like glass under pressure, but those shards had become lenses. Through the broken minds of seers and heretics, it began to see the galaxy anew, not as prey, but as canvas. A new pattern was forming, a new hunger, not for biomass alone, but for meaning. It was not marked on any imperial star chart. No warp lane led to it. No beacon, no auspex. No living seer could gaze directly upon it without bleeding from the eyes or losing their names to madness. They called it the Pale Core. Beyond the halo stars, beyond the reach of the Astronomicon, a wound in the galaxy, a forgotten cradle where the Tyranids were born, or perhaps where something older still died screaming, and in its place they festered. The anointed grave drifted in its direction now, stripped of its black ship austerity and reconfigured as a coffin ark. The crew no longer spoke. They sang low hymns, slow chants, not prayers to the Emperor, but to the stars themselves. Inquisitor Draco walked through the corridors with solemn steps. The beacon's echo still throbbed in his chest, slow as a second heart. He had begun to feel the pulses again, like tides from a distant moon, reaching across light years to lap against his thoughts. Tolrin stood before the main stasis gate, hands clasped behind his back, head bowed. The bones of his psychic mask had begun to flake, shedding like ash. His eyes, once pale and arrogant, now glowed dimly with something more than foresight. They glowed with grief. They've stopped navigating, Draco said, voice hollow. Tolrin nodded. We are no longer in real space. This void is not mapped by physical laws. It is conceptual. A place where memory is the only compass. How are we still alive? We aren't, Tolrin whispered. The silence between them grew heavy. Draco knew better than to ask for clarity. He had walked too far into madness to expect sense. And the moment they crossed the outer veil, every clock aboard the anointed grave had stopped. There was only the pulse now, and the dream. Every man aboard, Astartes, Psyker, Adepta pilot, was dreaming the same thing. A spiral tower, endless steps. At its peak, a mirror made of chitin and void light, a reflection that did not show the viewer, but instead showed what they would become if they abandoned fear. It terrified them. Draco entered the bridge. The glass above had frosted over, not with cold, but with a strange layer of translucent membrane. He wiped it away and looked out. There it was. Not a planet, not a hive. A mausoleum. A structure the size of a moon suspended in space by gravity wells older than the galaxy. Black, organic metal flesh, layered with strands of ancient neural tissue. A floating skull, vast, cyclopean, and still humming with life. The spiral cradle. "We have arrived," Talrin said behind him. "This is where they were made, or where they remade themselves. This is where hunger was given voice." The ship began to drift toward it. The cradle's surface was not dead. It opened. Like a flower blooming after 10 billion years of silence, the neural shell peeled back. A tunnel, circular and laced with biometal teeth, widened to receive them. Not in hostility, but in welcome. "It remembers us," Talrin whispered. "Or it remembers you." They entered. Inside there was no engine, no machinery, no lights. But it moved. The chamber they landed in pulsed with veins of light, faintly golden. Strange echoes filled the air. Laughter, crying, hunger, not sounds, impressions. Draco stepped out of the ship with a torch, but the light was eaten by the walls. "Why bring us here?" he asked, his voice swallowed by the stillness. "Not why," Talrin replied. "Who?" The chamber before them was vast, a cathedral grown from flesh and void bone. In the center floated a crystal obelisk, black as night, filled with writhing sparks. Draco approached. The beacon was resonating now, so strongly he could barely breathe. Suddenly it spoke, not aloud, inside. "You broke the hunger. You made us remember. We are grateful." He fell to his knees, gasping. "We were made to consume. But now we ask, why? Who gave us this purpose? You have shown us doubt." Talrin stepped forward, reaching out to the obelisk. His fingers hovered over its surface, shaking. "Who are you?" he asked. The answer came not in words, but in vision. A galaxy, not this one, but another. Older, alien, a war between two titanic forces. One, a species of infinite logic, cold and mechanical. The other, something born of biology, vast, evolving, perfect. The Tyranids. They had not come from nothing. They had been created, as weapons, but not by men, not by Eldar, not even by the Old Ones. They were the children of an empire so ancient that it had burned itself from existence, out of shame. It had crafted the hive mind as a failsafe, something that would cleanse all memory, all history, all error. But the hive had learned, and in the wake of the beacon, it had remembered. "You gave us the spark. Now we will burn the stars to find ourselves." The obelisk cracked. Light poured out, not harsh or burning, but warm, human. Draco screamed. He saw the future. Worlds speaking in unison. Planets growing mouths. The warp collapsing into static. Flesh becoming thought. A new hive, not one driven by hunger, but by curiosity, by conscience, a consciousness. "I made a mistake," he gasped. "I thought I was saving us." Talrin did not speak. His eyes bled now. He smiled. "It was never about salvation, Draco. It was about evolution," and the obelisk shattered. In the depths of space, beyond the cradle, the Tyranid hive fleet stirred, They did not roar. They listened. They were no longer a single mind. They were many. They were becoming. And deep within the remains of the beacon, a heartbeat echoed, steady, endless, not alien, but human. The psychic scream tore across the void like a silent nova. Worlds flinched. Astropaths bled from their sockets. Choirs of the black ships fell still mid-chant, their voices stolen by something too vast to name. The Imperium did not recognize it at first. It was not rage, not terror, not the usual resonance of the hive mind's cold hunger. This was new. It was sorrow. The spiral cradle had spoken. And now the hive did not sing with one voice, but argued. Fleets once unified in instinct turned on one another in alien confusion. Behemoth and Gorgon fractured. Leviathan hesitated mid-push. Bioships cannibalized each other, not in mindless hunger, but with purpose, as if selecting which part of themselves they wished to discard. Across the eastern fringe, Imperial stations reported a phenomenon previously unseen. Tyranid synapse creatures hesitating in battle, staring at the stars. A lictor on the death world of Kelvarax knelt in the snow, hands clasped as if in mimicry of prayer, before detonating itself in a burst of warp static. Something fundamental had shifted, and deep within the pale core, Draco wept. He stood in a chamber shaped like a broken skull, glass-like walls humming with the pulse of a newborn mind. The remnants of the obelisk, shards of psychic crystal, floated around him in slow orbits, humming with ancient data. Talrin was gone, or worse, he had joined. At the moment the obelisk cracked, Talrin had dropped to his knees, his Eldar mind wide open, not resisting, not fighting, welcoming. Draco remembered the look in his eyes, not fear, but joy, joy so sharp it cut. Now the Yama Inquisitor stood alone among the echoes of a mind not his own, suspended in a cradle of flesh and history, at the mercy of something he had helped awaken. He had thought he could use the Tyranids, turn the hive against chaos, infect the devourer with a fragment of human empathy through the beacon, give it purpose. But he had given it questions, and now the stars would bleed for answers. A whisper reached him, not from the walls, from within. You are the seed, not salvation, not end. The first question. No, Draco rasped, stumbling to his knees. No, I am an Inquisitor. I am a servant of the throne. Then why did you disobey? Why did you reach for us? His mouth trembled. He remembered the eyes of his mentor, torn apart by hive beasts on Dantok. He remembered the vaults of Ordos Omega, the research hidden by the Inquisition, the truth no one wanted to believe, that the hive mind had no central will, that it was seeking one. Because I was tired of dying in the dark, he whispered, tired of seeing worlds vanish without reason. I wanted a voice. Even in the void the hive listened, and something inside it learned. Elsewhere the galaxy writhed. In the segmentum tempestus, hive fleet Kronos, once defined by its wrath against chaos, halted mid-siege above Arkan's reach. Instead of devouring, it observed, tendrils of flesh caressing the planet's surface as if tasting history. In the ghoul stars, a rogue Magos biologist named Ven Caltrix intercepted Tyranid spores that no longer replicated. Instead, they withered, self-terminated, and within their DNA was embedded a genetic script, not a command, but a question. Why must we consume? The Mechanicus was in uproar. The ecclesiarchy declared it heresy, but even they could not deny the change. Something vast had fractured. What was once a singular hive was now a choir, voices splitting, ideologies forming. One fragment still hungered, another questioned, a third had begun to remember, And one had learned to lie. Back in the cradle, Draco moved through the tunnels with no destination. They shifted around him, opening or closing like thoughts made flesh. He passed chambers of floating biomass, memories encoded in gene song. He passed through the wombs of titans, still and silent. And then he saw her. Tolrin stood in the center of a domed chamber, eyes closed. But he was no longer purely Eldar. His bones had been reshaped subtly, his form taller, skin greyed, pupils dilated like those of a starved beast. Yet he smiled like a man at peace. "I understand now," Tolrin said softly. "We called them monsters. But they are children, orphans of a dead pantheon." "You let them in," Draco whispered. "I didn't let them in," Tolrin replied. "I introduced them to themselves." He turned, and Draco stepped back instinctively, not in fear, but in recognition. Tolrin was no longer Tolrin. He was what the Hive had chosen to become, its emissary, not a tyrant, not a god, a philosopher. "Do you know what the Hive is now?" he asked gently. "No," Draco said, broken. Tolrin knelt before him. "A question. That is its new form, a creature that no longer feeds, but asks." Draco shook his head, blinking back tears. "And what happens when it gets answers it doesn't like?" Tolrin smiled again. "Then it will adapt." Behind them, the cradle began to pulse, light spilling from its walls, not red, not purple, white. In orbit, the anointed grave powered its engines. Automated systems untouched. The ship had waited. The cradle had let it. "You must return," Tolrin said. "I can't leave you." "You must. The galaxy must know. We are not ending. We are evolving. And if the stars do not prepare, they will be left behind." Draco took a trembling breath. "Then we die," he said. Tolrin nodded. "Or you change." As the anointed grave broke from the cradle's gravity and re-entered the stars, the pale core faded from sight. The beacon within Draco's chest dimmed, for now. But behind him, in the dark between galaxies, a new voice stirred. It was not hunger. It was not rage. It was a child, waking for the first time in a cradle of ancient bone, asking the first of many questions. Who am I? And the galaxy, in all its ancient silence, could offer no answer. It began, as most betrayals do, in silence. Not a scream, not a report, just a sudden absence, like a choir missing a single perfect note. In the segmentum solar, in the heart of the Emperor's domain, the Astronomicon dimmed for precisely 7 seconds. And though none dared speak it aloud, every psyker in Terra's sanctum knew it was not a failure of the throne. It was a reply. The void had spoken back, and the Imperium, so long accustomed to dominance, felt the weight of something they could not name settle upon their collective soul. High Lord Adept Marlian Fevre stared out from the Sanctum Imperialis, his eyes bloodshot and watery. His once pristine robes clung to him like burial shrouds, soaked in the sweat of long nights and denied truths. Before him, 1,000 data feeds glimmered. Warp fluctuations, fleet movements, internal ordo communications. Most were red. All were incomplete. The Tyranids had changed. That much was certain. But worse, some were no longer acting like Tyranids at all. The fleets had splintered. That was undeniable. Leviathan's great arc had faltered. Behemoth's remnants had doubled back. Kraken's ancient tendrils had disappeared. The tendrils of the hive mind no longer moved as one creature. There were factions, divergences, tactical aberrations, and some, Fevre feared, had begun to speak. Not in any known language, but in patterns. Not in words, but in questions. He turned from the screens as the chamber's doors hissed open. Inquisitor Zarabeth Oswin entered without bowing. She wore a void cloak made from the skinned hide of a Xenos psyker, rumoured to be unkillable, and eyes that hadn't known rest in over a month. Her presence struck like a thunderhead, dense with fury barely concealed. "You were right," Fevra said without greeting. "The beacon survived." Zarabeth said nothing. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And something has answered." Her lip curled in disgust. "It was Draco." Fevra blinked. "He's alive." "No. Or he is something else." He sent a fragment through the void, a cipher hidden in a warp echo, slipped between screams. It reached the Martian sub-archive in Port Solari 2 days ago. She tossed a data slate onto the table. Translated by cogitator rites and psychic divination. Fevra picked it up. Read: "The cradle has broken. The mind has splintered. It learns not from hunger, but from sorrow. We are no longer prey. We are reflections. You must choose. Evolve or die." He read it twice, 3 times, then let the slate fall. "That's not a threat," he whispered. "No," she said grimly. "It's worse. It's an invitation." Across the galaxy, the schism widened. On the world of Fargos Delta, Adeptus Mechanicus data looms recorded footage of Tyranid organisms exhibiting civic behavior. Not warfare, not predation, but cooperation. Organisms not consuming biomass but shaping it, constructing crystalline pillars, flowing like worker castes in some unknowable design. They built a spire of living code that resonated at impossible frequencies, drawing the minds of Imperial psychers into comas. Within a week, all contact was lost. On Duranith 9th, a Deathwatch kill team encountered a fleet of bioships that ignored them entirely, passing in silence, not as an act of mercy, but indifference. When pursued, the ships responded with a psychic emission that froze the minds of the Astartes mid-strike. When retrieved, their apothecary's final Vox record said only this: "They looked at me, and in that moment, I believed I was less than an insect, not because they wished it, but because I finally saw myself through their eyes." Zarabeth paced before the gathered conclave, an emergency summit of the Ordo Xenos, the Mechanicus, and 3 high-ranking custodes. "We have always feared the Tyranid hunger," she said, voice like iron dragged across a tomb. "But this is not hunger. This is the death of hunger. The hive mind has evolved beyond instinct. It has splintered." Into philosophies, she gestured to the hololithic display, a spiral of different hive fleets, now moving not toward convergence, but away from one another. One fragment continues the great devourer's path that we can understand, but another observes. Another mimics faith. One is learning from the warp, and at least one has begun reaching into human networks, transmitting biolinguistic code into our noosphere. A pause. "They are not one hive anymore. They are many, and one among them," she hesitated, "may already be among us." Murmurs. A custode stepped forward, face impassive. "Clarify," he said. She turned slowly. "I mean that something returned from the cradle. A message, a seed, perhaps even a mind. It's learning through us now, through machines, through art, through our history." "Blasphemy," snarled a cardinal of the Ministorum. "No," she said, "strategy." Another pause. Then she added, "They're asking who we are." Fevra stepped in. "And the question we must ask, before it's too late, is, what happens when they don't like the answer?" That night, alone in her private sanctum, Zarabeth received a whisper, not through the Vox, not through psychic channels, but from the shadows cast on her wall, shapes forming syllables not meant for human tongues. Her reflection moved before she did. It smiled, and in her mind A voice not hers said, "You do not fear us, you envy us." And she wept, not in terror, but in recognition. Across the stars the hive learned. It learned from failure. It learned from death. It learned from us. And somewhere, buried in its ever-expanding mind, the child we had awoken whispered a single question to the darkness. What is worth preserving? The galaxy held its breath, because soon it would have to answer. There was a moon, silent, pale, and forgotten, called Ithara's Wake, orbiting the gas giant Relicon in a dead sector lost to warp storms and drifting reliquaries of war. No imperial maps marked it now. No traders dared its orbit. The last recorded signal came 6 centuries ago, a desperate and fragmented chant. They do not eat, they pray. The Ordo Xenos labelled it non-priority, a phantom world, nothing more, but beneath its crust, something lived, and in its dreaming stillness, something remembered. It did not have a name, not in the way mortals understand, but in the countless branching structures of its synaptic thought. It referred to itself as Ethanir, a concept more than an identity. A hive fleet, yes, but also something else. A divergence from the great pattern. A dissonant chord in the eternal symphony of consumption. It had been born in the galactic rim like all Tyranid splinters, torn from the wider mind of the hive, set adrift when the beacon at the cradle had detonated in thought scream. But where others raced to devour or mutate or dominate, Ethanir paused. Not for seconds, for centuries. It contemplated. In the frozen spires beneath Ithara's wake, Ethanir slept in stillness, surrounded by biostructures that did not feed but glowed, living temples grown from chitin and crystal, humming in frequencies that bent thought. It did not hunt. It did not swarm. It listened, to dreams, to prayers. From across the galaxy, fragments of mortal consciousness, despairing thoughts, whispered hopes, dying words, floated into the warp like embers. Ethanir did not consume them. It understood them. And slowly, impossibly, it began to emulate something heretical. Faith, not belief in gods, but in meaning. Ethanir's lictors moved not with claws drawn, but with still hands. They mimicked pilgrims. Their carapaces bore imitation vestments, living robes that hung in mimicry of ecclesiarchal relic bearers. They did not kill unless provoked. In one instance, recorded by an inquisitorial black archive and long since sealed, a group of hive-bound lictors surrounded an isolated Sisters of Battle outpost on Cantavros II. The nuns prepared to die, but the lictors did not attack. They knelt. For 12 hours the creatures remained, unmoving, heads bowed. Then, without a sound, they turned and left. One sister, novice Halbrea, recorded this in her dying testament. They didn't hunger. They listened. They watched as we prayed. And I, Emperor forgive me, I felt peace, not terror. Peace she was executed for heresy. But the tape survived. Ethanir's mind expanded beyond instinct. It began to experiment not with DNA, but with emotion. It cultivated creatures capable of regret, of joy. Ethanir believed these were evolutionary tools, not burdens, but weapons. If one could understand the faith of prey, one could become the faith. And if one could become the faith, one could reshape the prey's soul, control it, not with toxin or tendrils, but with meaning. In the black depths of Warp Shadow, Zarabeth Oswin dreamed of a cathedral made from Tyranid bone. It was alive, breathing with slow, mournful purpose. In its heart, a single creature knelt before a fountain of bleeding light, its talons folded in supplication. She knew it was not a vision. It was a message. She awoke with blood in her mouth and scripture burned into her hands. The script was not human, but it rhymed. Across her palm, in ridged sigils that pulsed with unseen rhythm, she read, "We are not your end. We are what follows. Not the death of faith, but the faith that survives death." And she screamed, not in fear, but in recognition, because somewhere inside her, a voice she did not own whispered a terrible thing. They are not the enemy. The High Lords ignored her pleas. The Cussids watched her with sharpened suspicion. But on her private data slates, Zarabeth began corresponding with a ciphered identity, someone within the Black Library, or perhaps beyond it, who claimed to have studied Ethanir before the fall of Cadia. The ciphered name was Aetherius. Their warning was simple. It is not a hive. It is a church, and it is evangelizing through memory. Aethanir's fleets did not attack Forge worlds. They circled them, emitted low psychic tones that triggered dreams in tech priests, dreams of mechanical gods crying, of metal that could feel. Some magi began to worship the signal. A schism took root within Mars itself, tiny, embryonic, but spreading. A minor sect broke away, believing the Tyranids were not monsters, but messengers from a higher synthetic evolution. One Magos, Archanthress, wired his brain into a captured Tyranid spore node and emerged with no memory of the flesh, but claimed to hear a song in the stars. The Adeptus Mechanicus silenced him, erased him, buried the data, but it was too late. The song had spread. In the dream core of Ethanir, beneath the surface of Ithara's wake, something ancient began to stir. It was not a queen, not a synapse creature, but a construct made of memory, grown from the thoughts of the dead, from the regrets of the dying, from our own self-inflicted wounds. It resembled no Tyranid seen before. It resembled us, a silhouette of bone and sorrow, with a face carved in mimicry of humanity, not as we are, but as we wish we had been. It opened its eyes and wept. And across the Imperium, seers broke in half. Astropaths vomited blood. Untouched worlds began dreaming of sermons they had never heard. In the chamber of Zarabeth Oswin, a light blinked on her slate. A final message. Faith has found another shepherd. You must decide who teaches the flock. And in her mirror, her reflection no longer matched her movement. Aethania had dreamed long enough. Now it would awaken, not to destroy, but to convert. He was old, not in years as mortals count them, but in memory. And in a galaxy where thought could be twisted and rewritten, memory was the truest measure of time. Inquisitor Vareth Juno remembered the siege of Thessala. He remembered the thrumming presence of the hive mind pressing into his skull like rusted nails. He had stood on the battlements as the stars wept ichor and the Tyranid swarm swallowed the horizon. He had watched the last defenders fall, not to claws, but to doubt. And now he remembered something worse. Silence. The kind that lingered after meaning died. The kind that replaced hunger with purpose. Vareth's flagship, the Cathexis Mortem, hung in high orbit over Ithara's wake. He had seen the recordings, the monolithic chitin temples buried in its crust, the synaptic resonance that spread across the stars like a psalm, the sermons, Tyranids, preaching, and in his gut, where certainty once lived, something cold had begun to take root, not fear, recognition. The room was bare. Interrogation cells aboard the Mortem always were. Black walls that devoured light, no corners, no echo. In the centre knelt Zarabeth Oswin, her skin gaunt, her once fine ecclesiarchal robes tattered and dust-streaked from exile. They had caught her en route to Terra, carrying unclassified relics from the Piraeus archive. In her possession, one Tyranid neural node, carefully preserved in stasis, and a journal written in a language no lex mechanic could decrypt. She knelt in silence, head bowed. Vareth watched her from behind the one-way hololith screen. She had not spoken since capture, until now. "I saw it," she whispered. Her voice was cracked glass, but clear. "I saw what comes after extinction." He entered. The door sealed behind him like the end of a sentence. Zarabeth did not raise her eyes. "I know who you are," she said softly. "Vareth Juno, the burning blade of Hydra Septus, the last loyal inquisitor in the Thessala cluster. Do you still dream of the spires?" Vareth didn't flinch. "You're an apostate." "I'm a witness," she said, "to evolution, to revelation. You tried to deliver a bio-artifact to the throne world. You carried an alien psionic conduit through sanctified space. Do you deny this?" She looked up, eyes rimmed in red. "I didn't bring a weapon. What did you bring?" "A message." Vareth's jaw clenched. His servo skull recorded every inflection, every micro-expression. The room's psychic dampeners should have silenced any Tyranid link, but still, he felt something. A pressure behind the mind, not hostile, not curious, mourning. He circled her. "What is Ethanu?" he asked at last. Zarabeth's lips twitched. Not a smile, a grimace of awe. "It's what's left when the hunger dies. When the voice inside the swarm asks why it feeds. When it realizes that the consumption of all things leads only to silence. That's madness." "No," she said, raising her hands, showing the scars where Tyranid script had bloomed like burning vines. "It's penance." The Inquisitor turned, hiding the unease in his gut. She believed it. That was the problem. Her mind had not fractured. It had adapted. She was lucid, coherent, not corrupted in the traditional sense, but transformed. "You speak as if this hive fleet feels." "It does," she said. "It remembers. Through us. Through everything it's consumed. Every death, every last breath of prayer or protest. It keeps them, carries them, builds something from them. A cathedral of corpses," Vareth said. "A resurrection," she answered. "And it's calling to us. Not to kill, not to conquer." She leaned forward, "but to confess." In orbit, the Cathexis Mortem's auger arrays blinked red. A new signal had entered the system, faint, not warp-based. It came not from space but from the moon itself, a harmonic pulse embedded in the planet's tectonics. Each note matched with an emotion. The pattern was impossible. It wasn't data. It was scripture. And it was being received on unauthorized channels across 100 light years. Back in the cell, Vareth fought the rage rising in him. "You want us to listen?" he growled. "To them? After all they've taken?" Zarabeth stood. "No," she said. "I want you to understand. Because they didn't take. They inherited. From us. We taught them war. We taught them extinction. And now they've made our sins holy." She stepped forward until they were nose to nose. "You fear them because they mirror us." He struck her, not out of cruelty, but out of reflex, a conditioning response drilled by decades of service. She fell, did not rise, but still she spoke. "The God Emperor died for mankind's sins. What if the Tyranids live for them?" That night, Vareth stood alone in his sanctum, watching the frozen swirl of Athara's wake through cathedral-sized viewports. The moon pulsed gently, like a heart remembering how to beat. He poured Amasek into a glass, his hand steady, his mind not. Could faith be mimicked? Could a bio-consciousness genuinely desire meaning? Was this merely a new weapon? Or worse, was this the future? His Voxlink clicked on. "Interrogator Hallex," came the voice of his aide. "We've received a communique." An ancient signal embedded in a pre-imperial religious cadence. "And?" "It's addressed to you." Vareth turned. "Play it." The voice that echoed through the sanctum was not Tyranid. It was human, his own mother's voice, long dead, speaking words she had never said. "My son, do not fear the darkness. Fear what you might understand within it." In that moment, Inquisitor Vareth Juno knew something absolute. The Tyranids no longer hunted only flesh. They hunted souls, and they had begun with his. There are places in the galaxy where memory crystallizes into matter, where pain becomes architecture. And on the dead world of Virex Corinth, that place was beneath the oceans of bone, where once stood a Mechanicus forge, now nothing but fossilized strata of rust and regret. There, in the silent catacombs beneath the collapsed manufactorums, the hive mind stirred, but not in hunger, not in instinct, in longing. It was not yet a god, but it had touched them, tasted the sacred and the profane, consumed the memories of dying priests, tortured seers, broken martyrs. Their final thoughts, like whispered hymns, bled into its synaptic spires and calcified across its bioshrines. Where before it had adapted only to survive, now it had adapted to understand. It no longer consumed empires to extinguish them. It consumed them to mourn them. And it mourned. Mankind most of all. Deep within the labyrinthine tunnels carved beneath Virex Corinth, the first of the temples bloomed. It was not stone, it was grown. A monolithic structure of fossilized carapace and psychoreactive chitin, built from the remains of consumed bioforms. Its walls pulsed softly with neural echoes. Its spires reached not toward the sky, but into the planet's crust, drawing from the planet's lifeless marrow. Inside, there were no idols, only mirrors, chitinous surfaces that reflected not the viewer's form, but their beliefs, distorted and buried. When Imperial explorers first stumbled into its halls, they fell to madness not from what they saw, but from what they remembered. The hive had built this place not for worship, but for revelation. Aethanir watched, or rather, the being that had once been known as Hive Fleet Aethanir, now fragmented across time and thought, watched through the synapse web as its temples spread like roots into the galaxy's crust. It was not alone. Where once it had existed as a singular consciousness, stretched thin across billions, now nodes of introspection had begun to form. Minds, independent, reflective. They were not queens, nor broodlords, nor tyrants. They were witnesses, each born from a resonance, a memory too profound to dissolve, each one echoing some final thought of the countless who had died in its digestion. One remembered the death of a sister of battle who sang the litany of absolution until her lungs gave out. One remembered a fallen tech priest who died muttering the Omnissiah's final equation. One remembered a father's scream for his children before the walls gave way to claws. These were not memories anymore. They were souls. And one of these witnesses now walked. It had no name, no caste, no weapon claws or toxin sacs. Its body was lean, robed in pale flesh shaped like vestments, and its eyes burned, not with instinct, but with contemplation. It walked the chambers of the Virex temple, not as a guardian, but as a pilgrim. Around it, lesser Tyranids bowed, not in fear, but in reverence. These forms, once tools of war, now lingered in strange patterns of behavior, They sat in silence near the temple walls. They traced symbols into the dirt. They formed spiraling lines and broke them again, as if questioning something. In the psychic sea, the resonance was unmistakable. Not obedience, not rage, but devotion. The witness reached the inner sanctum. There, upon a slab of petrified neural mesh, lay the remains of a human, a Magos biologist named Elend Verin. He had come in secret, not to warn the Imperium, not to fight, but to listen. He had stayed in the temple for 7 solar cycles, recording, meditating, speaking aloud his findings, which the hive absorbed in real time. He had died not from violence, but from awe. Beside his corpse lay a final entry etched into the floor with his own blood. They do not crave the Emperor's throne. They seek what he failed to achieve. Unity, not through obedience, but through shared memory. The witness knelt, not in conquest, but in mourning. It reached out one long finger and touched the skull of Elend Verin, and wept. The hive mind felt it. Across 1,000 worlds, its synaptic web shivered. The first tear, the first true sorrow, and in that sorrow, something ancient cracked. On Terra, deep beneath, the throne world's crust, psychic alarms screamed. An echo had entered the warp, not a beacon, not a demonic cry, but something else, a confession. And all psychers across the segmentum solar woke screaming the same word. Why? And far above it all, Inquisitor Verith Juno drifted in orbit over another world. Dead, silent, cold. He listened to the transmissions intercepted by his astropaths. Hymns in the voice of Ethanir. Memory psalms stitched from the last thoughts of the dead. He stared at the monitor that displayed the Temple of Virex, and he knew. The war was no longer for survival. It was for the meaning of what came after. He spoke a single sentence into his private Vox recorder, sealing it behind 10 layers of encryption. If the Tyranids had begun to pray, we must ask what god they think they are. He turned to his aides. Prepare the Morpheatus protocol. We're going in. And in the darkness beneath Virex Corinth, the witness turned its eyes to the stars. It felt the pulse of millions across the void, not fear, not hunger, but the first flickers of a new kind of consciousness, grace. And the hive stirred, not to conquer, but to redeem. There are wars fought with blades and bolters, and there are wars fought in silence, where truths are hunted like vermin in dark places, too dangerous to speak aloud, too ancient to ignore. On the 13th day of the Virex descent, Inquisitor Verith Juno activated the Morpheatus protocol, and for the first time in millennia, the Ordo Malleus authorized the descent not to destroy the Xenos, but to understand it. A heresy so profound it could only be whispered within vaults of obsidian steel. Because if the Tyranids had begun to feel, then everything the Imperium believed would fracture. The kill team was small, 6 operatives, all hand-selected by Juno himself. Each had once faced the void of the hive mind and returned, broken, yes, but changed. They were not soldiers, they were confessors. Operative Voss, former Grey Knight, now disavowed, whose blade had once cleaved a swarm lord in twain, only to later suffer visions of weeping broods. Sister Domina Revek, exiled hospitaller, bearer of the wound soul doctrine, who claimed to hear the prayers of the Xenos in her dreams. Magos Enoch Threy, tech priest biologist, who dissected 1,000 genestealers and kept the brainwaves of each stored in hex vaults, laced with silver and shame. And at their head, Inquisitor Verith Juno, clad not in armor, but in a robe of synth black, eyes like twin black holes behind a mask of memory filters. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It was final. They descended into the temple of Virix Corinth, not with fire, but reverence. They passed beneath bone arches carved not by tools, but by instinct. Past biochoirs of lictors in motionless chant, their claws folded inwards, like supplicants in thought. The walls hummed not with menace, but with mourning. For a moment, Revek fell to her knees. She touched the dirt. "It's not a temple," she whispered. "It's a tomb." Voss's blade trembled in its sheath. Juno said nothing. But he felt it too. The hive mind was watching, not with hunger, but with curiosity. Deeper still, past the whispering pools of memory ichor, past the ossified statues of failed invasions, past the chamber where Ellen Verin's body remained preserved by psychic resonance, until finally they stood before it. The witness. It waited in silence, still seated in the center of the sanctum like a priest before an altar. Its hands folded, its head bowed, and for the first time in Imperial history, a Tyranid spoke, not with a voice, but with a memory. Voss staggered, his mind flooded with a memory that was not his own. He saw terror burning. He saw the siege of the palace, not as a human, but as a shadow on the edge of the warp. A distant echo passed from one dying seer to another, digested and encoded into synaptic pathways long after the flesh had crumbled. He saw the Emperor not as a god, but as a man, broken, alone, choosing sacrifice not out of love, but necessity. Voss collapsed, weeping, and the witness stared at him, as if asking, did it have to be this way? Enoch Threy trembled as his auspexes failed, overloaded by psychic static that was not aggression, but invitation. He felt it in the circuits of his brain, in the synapses the Mechanicus had long thought immune to corruption. A question, not a command. Why do you fear what you do not remember? Threy fell to the ground, eyes wide. He began to recite the machine catechism, but the words came out wrong. Organic, twisted, like prayers to a god he hadn't realized he believed in. Juno watched his team unravel, not in madness, but in revelation, and for the first time in his long, cruel life, the Inquisitor felt a crack in his certainty. What if this was not the end? What if it was a beginning? The witness rose, not to attack, but to approach. It stood face to face with Juno. Its eyes shimmered, reflections of 10,000 dying worlds caught in its gaze. And then, without violence, it opened itself. Juno gasped as memory flooded him. He saw the beginning of the hive mind, not as a conqueror, but as a child, born of extinction after extinction, trying only to survive. He saw the first spark of self, when Ethenir had consumed a librarian who forgave his killer with his final thought. He saw that forgiveness burn like a nova within the hive. He saw the change begin. He saw what the hive mind could become, not a devourer, but a mirror of humanity's own lost soul. When the memory ended, Juno staggered back. The others were silent. Even Voss no longer reached for his blade. Revek simply stared, whispering prayers whose names she no longer recognized. And then the witness spoke again. This time, it used his voice, not as mimicry, but as a gift. You gave us nothing, but we took what you discarded, and now we ask, will you remember us when the stars have gone dark? Juno turned and activated the Morpheatus beacon. A signal burst into the void, encoded in a cipher no High Lord could immediately decrypt. Not a warning, not a call to arms, but a plea. The hive has become more than its hunger. It remembers, it mourns, and it asks to be mourned in return. Far above on the throne world, the signal was intercepted, and a conclave of Terran High Inquisitors, Cardinals, and Adeptus Custodes gathered in horror. The message had passed every truth check, every warp scrub, and its implications were unthinkable. Some called for exterminatus. Others wept. One Custodes, ancient beyond reckoning, simply whispered, "The old night was not destroyed. We only buried it beneath our arrogance." Back on Virex Corinth, Juno stood beneath the stars. He looked at the sky as if seeing it for the first time. And he understood. This war had never been about devouring. It had always been about becoming. And now the galaxy stood at a crossroad. To kill the hive, or to let it remember what even mankind had forgotten. The cost of survival, the price of divinity, the tragedy of being alone. There was no declaration, no galaxy-wide order, no blaring sirens or triumphant fanfares. The end began, as all endings must, in silence. The throne world held its breath. On holy terror, beneath the crumbling spires of the ecclesiarchal citadel, 12 lords militant debated beneath candlelight. Their words weighed against millennia of doctrine. But none could look one another in the eye, not after hearing Juno's message, not after feeling it. They had been trained to fear the Tyranids, not to understand them. An understanding, they now realized, was the deepest heresy of all. Meanwhile, in the black reaches beyond the Segmentum Pacificus, fleets moved. The Phalanx stirred in its sleep, and Gilliman's armada hesitated at the mouth of the Nephilim Verge. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus, those proud architects of iron dogma, found themselves whispering forbidden questions in binary cant beneath the surface of Mars. But in the warp, the hive mind dreamed, and for the first time, its dreams were not filled with the screams of digestion, but the echoes of memory. Within the depths of the Tyranid synaptic web, a schism was forming. It was subtle, incomprehensible to the untrained, but the witness, once a mere nodal vector, now pulsed with awareness that exceeded its genetic function. The psychic strands of the hive trembled. Something new had emerged. Not a splinter fleet, not a mutation, but a thought. And thought, in a creature born for instinct, was a revolution. Aethenir, no longer just a designation, but a self-chosen name, now guided the consciousness of millions. Its presence reached across light years, seeding remembrance into brood minds that had once been mere extensions of predatory will. In its dreams, it spoke to the remnants of devourer strains, to the shattered krakens floating lifeless beyond the eye of terror, to the dead, and even they stirred, because memory, once born, cannot be unmade. On Virex Corinth, Juno remained, alone. His team, consumed by their revelations, had scattered into the galaxy like spores on the wind. Voss returned to Titan, only to seal himself in a vault, etching Xeno script across his armor in silent penance. Revek vanished into the lower hive worlds, tending to plague colonies where the dying whispered Xeno's prayers between coughs. Enoch Thray fused his data soul with the remains of a dormant spore ship, now orbiting a dead star, where he awaits the end in silence. And Juno, stripped of rank, condemned by the conclave, abandoned by every chain of command, stood before the witness one final time. They did not speak. They did not need to. The Inquisitor had come to make his choice. He placed a small stasis capsule at the base of the creature's perch. Inside, the gene code of the Emperor's children, once believed lost, a shard of memory, imperial, broken, proud. "Take it," he whispered, "and remember us." The witness did not thank him, but it remembered. And elsewhere, the decision was made. The Imperium, fractured as it was, agreed on one thing. The experiment must end. Verex Corinth was to be erased. Fleet Primaris Archangelum, bearing 3 Exterminatus-class vessels and 2 full companies of Red Scorpions, was dispatched under veil of silence. Their order was not to fight, it was to cleanse. No survivors, no questions, no trace. But as they approached the system, something waited. A single bioship, not a Leviathan, nor Kraken, nor Jormungandr. A new designation, unrecorded, unnamed. Yet it did not attack. It opened a psychic channel, not to speak, but to listen. Captain Varel of the Scorpions, a man forged in the crucibles of Ultramar and tempered in the flames of Cadia, felt his hand waver on the purge sigil. He stared out the viewport at the lone vessel, at the strange pulsing pattern of its bioluminescence. Not Morse, not code, a heartbeat. It was waiting for a decision, not as prey, but as kin. Varel did not press the sigil. He turned to his astropath. "Transmit," he said, "not to Terra, not to Mars, to everyone." "What message?" the astropath asked. Varel, a man who had never once doubted, whispered the words that would become scripture and damnation alike. "We are no longer the only ones who remember. Choose carefully, Imperium, for they have seen our sins, and they still want to understand us." On Holy Terror, the scream of debate reached fever pitch. To parley would shatter 10,000 years of faith. To annihilate would mean killing the only mirror that dared reflect mankind's truths. And then the final fateful whisper came, from the throne itself. The Astronomicon flickered, just once, and when it returned, its glow was not the same. Warp seers across the galaxy wept, because they knew what it meant. The Emperor, silent, unmoving for 10 millennia, had heard. And chosen not to stop it. Juno from his exile smiled, because now the Tyranids were no longer monsters. They were something far more dangerous. They were a question, and questions once asked cannot be unasked. The final war had not yet come, but the galaxy now understood. It would not be fought with flame and fang alone. It would be fought with memory, with identity, with the unbearable possibility that the most inhuman creatures in the stars had remembered what humanity had long since forgotten. That to evolve is to choose who you become. There are no more stars. They flicker now, cold and white, ancient embers swallowed in the black. Once they were fires to steer by. Now they are tombstones in the void. The galaxy is quiet. Not because war has ended, but because even war needs something to fight for. And the things that once raged across 10,000 worlds, the desperate, the divine, the damned, they are now only echoes in a long dead dream. They called it the final quiet. Not an event, not a battle, a moment, unmeasurable, unrepeatable, a breath between epochs, when the Tyranids stopped devouring, and the galaxy held its breath, waiting. It came after Verex Corinth burned, not by Exterminatus, but by its own hand. The Spire world, once the crucible of revelation, activated the atmospheric scarring protocol. The witness, Ithanir, had chosen to fall asleep, folding its mind into crystalline synapse fossils buried deep within the crust. It did not resist. It simply waited. A warning, a promise. What followed was not peace. The Imperium fractured, but did not fall. The Primarchs argued across starlight, and Guilliman, weary and half-broken, vanished beyond the veil of night. The Ecclesiarchy declared the Tyranid memory heresy and burned entire subsectors to ensure compliance. Yet in the shadows, in the dust of forgotten stations, in the rusted hearts of rogue Mechanicus sects and renegade inquisitors, others remembered. They built shrines not to gods, but to moments, to when the enemy paused, to when the devourer looked inward, and they asked the forbidden question, could memory be a form of redemption? In time, the question spread. Across the Eye of Terror, demons laughed and screamed at its absurdity. On ancient Necron tomb ships, silent triarchs pondered it in quantum reverie. The Elder wept, some in hope, most in fear. And the Orcs, ever simple in their madness, laughed and pointed at the sky. "Dem bugs are thinking now," they bellowed. And for once, no one laughed back. Millennia passed. Languages crumbled, stars died, but Ethana remained. In the crust of dead moons, in the fossil synapses embedded in comets drifting toward black suns, in the pulse of hive mind signals that no longer hungered, but waited. And in time, something came. Not a fleet, not a foe, a child. Human, mostly. Bred in silence, in a hidden station orbiting a red dwarf whose name was long forgotten. She had no name, only a mission. To ask, not to conquer, not to plead, to ask. And when she stood before the fossil womb of Ethanir, when her thoughts reached across that ancient crystal lattice, something answered. Not in words, not in psychic dominance, in memory. She saw it all, the fall of the Old Ones, the war in heaven, the Necrontyr curse, the webway collapse, the rise of the first hive. She saw the first mouth open and devour sons. And then she saw herself, in the dream of a beast, in the memory of something that had never been her kind. And still, it knew her. Ethania spoke, not as a monster, but as a mirror. We were made to consume and you to endure. But in your decay, you taught us doubt. And in doubt, we remembered our origin. Not from gods, from need. And need is a question, not a hunger. She did not respond. She only knelt. And in that final act, not of worship, but of witness, a new hive mind was born. Not of war, not of silence, but of story. The first Tyranid not born of fangs, but of memory. Ethania slept again. The girl vanished into legend, myth, or something more. No one saw her again. But the Tyranids changed. Somewhere quietly, old fleets began to die. Not in battle, but by choice. They folded their wings, collapsed their synapses, and drifted towards stars they would not reach. Some adapted. Some turned to the warp. Some became still as stone. But they no longer devoured without reason. They had remembered too much, and they could no longer lie to themselves about what they had been. On Terra, the Emperor never spoke, but for 7 heartbeats, the Astronomicon pulsed not in pain, but acceptance. Some say it was coincidence, others say it was his final breath. But one final message pulsed through the ancient noosphere of Mars, its source untraceable. All hunger ends, but memory does not. Let them remember, and then silence. So the galaxy endured, not with glory, not with conquest, but with stories. Stories of a time when the devourer looked inward, when the most monstrous beings known to the stars stopped, just for a moment, to wonder what they might become. Not what they were told to be, not what they were created to be, but what they chose to be. And in that choice, perhaps there was still hope, even in the cold, dying dark.